During the first break, Carla had the bad taste to come up and ask me how old I was. We realized that we were definitely of the older generation in the room, that there are literally several decades that separate the three of us from most everybody here today. And I'm going to, in my presentation, ilau mai lao, and take the prerogative of age. And I think one of the things that is so interesting that comes through in the presentations is what you can take for granted. And this is part of my sociological approach is what can you take for granted and why can you take certain things for granted? And so the things that, studying NGOs, all this kind of stuff, to those of us of the older generation is pretty, still very surprising and inconceivable, almost. And looking through the papers, one of the things that struck me is how, I don't want to say time-bound, but how there are very few references to the civil society debates of the 80s and 90s. It's almost as if this whole field just emerged in the late 1990s. So one of the things I'm going to do is justify my existence. So what I want to do, a couple of different things, is first I want to sort of interweave my personal, my fascinating personal biography with some intellectual development of the field. Is in the 1980s, I started studying Gatihu. My original work was on Taiwan, and I looked at Taiwan's political economy, and then I had an opportunity to live in China. I was the first American government exchange student at Fudan in 1979. And only in the 80s did I become aware of the emergence of the Gatihu, of this what we would now call micro-entrepreneur sector. And I began to study Gatihu as a window into the expanding area of privacy or of individual empowerment or of individual autonomy in China. This was a big difference from the year that I had studied in 1979 when there was no individual autonomy. The party led everything, very little in the way of individual empowerment. And the difference between Gong and Si, between the public sphere and the private sphere, was non-existent. There was no private sphere to speak of. One of the things I discovered in my year there was how China operated on so many different levels, and people did have their own ideas and so on, but still the public was so much more dominant over the private. During the course of this research in the 1980s, there was the emergence of the Solidarity movement in Poland and the whole civil society explosion in Eastern Europe. So then I began to think about using Gatihu not only to look at privacy, but look at it as a potential foundation, material foundation for civil society in China. In 1988-89, I had the opportunity to be a National Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And while I was there, I participated in a workshop which was organized by Philippe Schmitter, Terry Carl, and Larry Diamond on civil society. And at that time, there were all these people at Stanford and at the Hoover Institution from Eastern Europe, East Asia. This was after the democratic transitions in South Korea, in Taiwan. There was all this stuff going on in Eastern Europe. And it was an unbelievable group of people and an unbelievable seminar. And so then, of course, culminating my year at the Hoover Institution was Tiananmen. So this was an extraordinary education in civil society, the potential of civil society. I published several generally uncited articles on civil society in China. I can give you some reference. I don't even remember. And sometimes I think I should go back and see. I noticed, Carla, that you actually. I was stunned to see a reference to them. Thank you very much. I don't know if your book is in the CCSI up my count, dramatic. But there was a big debate over the relevance of the term civil society for China. And some of you may be aware of a special issue of Modern China in the 1993, where Fred Wakeman, my late colleague, had a very ill-tempered, nasty attack, especially on Bill Rowe, about the relevance or lack thereof of the concept of civil society for China, and if you use it, you're not a nice person. And so a lot of people in the West, in America, stopped using the term civil society entirely to talk about China because it was just such an incendiary, why do I want to get involved in all of this stuff? But the interesting thing was, of course, that the Chinese started using the term civil society. And they use it in an analytical sense, a normative sense, and a strategic sense. So it was really surprising, especially in 2005 to be invited to the conference which inaugurated the Civil Society Center at Beida, where I met Carla for the first time, and Gao Bingzhong, who had been at Berkeley, was also very instrumental at that conference. To see, here we're afraid in America to talk about civil society, and here Beida was giving a blessing to the concept of civil society. So I've done a certain amount of research in the last few years on NGOs in China, but my focus is not on the NGOs that most of you are dealing with, but on NGOs, international NGOs. I'm interested in the role of NGOs in China, and I focused on two in particular. One is an environmental one, and one is a microfinance one. And I've given talks many, many times and have yet to write it up. But the first iteration of my one on the environment was I presented it in 2005, but I didn't let them include it in a volume because I was going to revise it for publication. I serve on a number of boards in the Bay Area and nationally, most of which deal with Asia or China, but not all of them. So I have a lot of personal experience in nonprofits. In our department, the sociology department at Berkeley, we pride ourselves on what we call public sociology, which is basically, that's one aspect of it, and Jessica knows about being a public intellectual. I'm an advisor to the public intellectual program of the National Committee that Jessica's one of our pippers, we call them. Now, I want to talk a bit about theory, which is one of my main interests, and I have a kind of a French disease that I'm worried about. If it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And now we've had a lot of data shared today, and the question is, what's the best theory? A number of people, you've used many different theories to approach these questions. What's the best theory? We've have political geography, political economy, organizational ecology. Durkheim has been mentioned a number of times, and not enough times, but as I find that the older I get, Bingzhong was, the older I get, the more Durkheimian I become. And I find that Durkheim is for older people because it raises all these issues of trust and solidarity and loneliness. What is going to prevent you? Why shouldn't you commit suicide? And the importance of joining organizations and that sort of thing. De Tocqueville, I don't think has been mentioned, but of course de Tocqueville is critical in this because in Democracy in America, he talks about in the old world, people waited around for someone above them to tell them what to do. And what struck him about America was people take the initiative. Oh, there's a problem. Let's get a group together and solve that problem. And for him, that was one of the quintessential unique features of the United States. But my own main influence comes from both Pierre Bourdieu and my colleague Neil Fligstein, especially the work on organizational fields and social fields. Now, we've used the term sector a lot today, which is another way of expressing this idea of fields. Reza Carolyn, He-Jian, you have used this in particular. What I'm interested in as a sociologist related to this idea of Bourdieu and Fligstein is the process of establishing rules to govern particular realms of social life. So we can call these rules institutions, or we can call these rules laws. So Carla was complaining before that people weren't talking about law. So now, institutions are, laws are formalizing a lot of these things we take for granted institutions. So the field that we have been discussing, the social field we've been discussing today, is the NGO, the field of NGOs. So we would ask, what is the main form of capital or resources that people use to gain power in the NGO field? I'll just raise that and put it aside. We could consider that later. But I think it's important that we understand that these fields are not God-given. They're not naturally occurring. They're social constructions. And it's critical that we have a historical understanding of this as well. What were the pre-existing conditions out of which these fields arose? Well, in the PRC, you've got, we don't have to talk about Chinese history and tradition, though that came up a bit, but you've got Leninism, you've got the Cultural Revolution, you've got the reforms, and the reforms in China occurred without state collapse. So it's not like Eastern Europe where you had nothing. But one of the things that struck me my year in China in 1979, right after the third plenum, was that the old system, the old institutions had clearly collapsed, but nobody knew what to replace them with. So there was a great deal of questioning about what should our society look like. And as one of the handful of Westerners in Shanghai, and traveling around various parts of China, it was really interesting to observe people asking these questions about what kind of society do we want to build. But they had all this mindset derived from Leninism, derived from the Cultural Revolution. Oh, okay, great, and all that sort of stuff. Now, the Communist Party's mindset is a Leninist mindset. A Communist Party grows as a conspiracy within a larger society. So it's not a surprise that the Communist Party fears or assumes, not just fears, assumes that anyone who organizes an association without party leadership or party initiative is a conspirator. They're doing this as a conspiracy to overthrow the state. It's very difficult to get out of that mindset to think, why did you organize that group? You obviously have ulterior motives, chio itu. You're not doing this because you want to help women, because you want to help poor rural girls, because you want to help workers. You obviously chio itu. You've got some ulterior motive here. So one of the questions that was raised before about what causes change within a field. Well, we could take a Parsonian sort of structural functionalist approach to thinking about, okay, you've got equilibrium in a field, if it's there, it's functioning, and the only stimulus comes from the outside. So that's one possibility, that what's going to cause change in field, some sort of stimulus from the outside. But people in one field, like the NGO field, none of us exists in just one field. We exist in many different fields, and we carry ideas from one field into another field. So when you talk about somebody in an NGO field might have been a business person, might have been a worker, might have been someone with HIV, and they're going to carry those ideas from one field to another, and that can stimulate change. One other thing is now you've got, with a lot of the changes in China with the use of the internet, that's a major way of bringing ideas where we've been talking about horizontal linkages. And you don't have to meet people. You can Skype them, you can use all sorts of new technology and get a lot of kinds of ideas which are going to may stimulate change within a particular field. I think that the Communist Party state has no grand design beyond maintaining power. So this idea about the Communist Party has this vision about society and all this sort of stuff, I have no vision whatsoever, except staying in power and maintaining the privileges of themselves and their families. Also, I think one of the things that's so clear from the discussion today and emphasized over and over again is that China's not a monolith, that it operates at all these different levels in all these different geographical areas. So it's so hard to generalize. So that's why that's where I think this idea of fields and so on is good, because it helps us step back or step up and discuss a lot of these things. But the Communist Party is also capable of learning, and I think that's critical. It's not only a monolith, but it's not static. And the party realized, the people within the party, some of them, realize that there's, what does it mean to lead? 党要领导一切. What does it mean to 领导? Does it mean you have to control absolutely everything? Or does it mean that you figure out ways to work with all sorts of different organizations? As society in China becomes increasingly complex, you can't guan everything. How do you figure out this kind of a dance? How do you figure out what is going to keep you in power, what's not going to overthrow you, what's going to make China, fuqiang, wealthy and strong? I think China is in a constant process of improvisation. I think, 摸着石头过河, crossing the river by feeling for the stones, is accurate. There's no grand design. It's just going from day to day. And I think one of the things that comes through in the papers is that it's a whole process of mutual adaptation. I thought of it, was going to use the term anyway, but I think Jennifer used the term mutually constitutive, is that you've got both the state and NGOs are playing off each other and building each other in the process. I think it was Jen who used the term of a naughty child. I was going to use the term limit testing. We talk about children testing limits. And I think what the NGOs are doing is testing limits. What can I get away with? And part of the whole grand design thing is I think the party has no vision of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Is they're just seeing, is this going to actually serve a particular population? It's not going to overthrow us. And they said, 总结经验, is they sum up, this is part of what the Communist Party has done for a long time, is sum up experience and decide what can be permitted, what can't be permitted. What should we put into formal legislation? What should we just have an understanding that this is okay? So the Communist Party is very, very pragmatic in this. So I think, so again, part of my research, one of my interests is what is the role of Ngos in the NGO field? And I was really surprised, it could have been a selection of, who you selected to be at the conference, that nobody talked about Ngos. And I think that their critical role, the Ford Foundation was mentioned, maybe Nicholas will talk about Canada, but I think the whole role of foreigners in some fields versus other fields. In some, it stirs suspicion by the party. In others, say, well, this is like, Bill Gates or somebody, they come in, they're doing, that's okay. So the Ngos, one Ngo that I was involved in, their main work in China is capacity building. And one of the things that they do is bring grassroots organizations together for seminars, for retreats, to work on building their capacity. Now, one question I would have that we might want to think about is the role of Hong Kong NGOs in China. We've been talking about Chen Jianmin from CUHK, Kinman Chan, about working in the Center of Civil Society at CUHK and so on. Does Hong Kong, and to a lesser extent Taiwan, what is the object lesson that gives to the Chinese authorities and to Chinese NGO activists? Is it, hey, we're Chinese, we can do this too? Or is it, oh boy, look what happened in Taiwan, look what's happening in Hong Kong, we better make sure that these NGO guys don't get out of control? Okay, then I wanted to address the social entrepreneurship issue. Is that I've had a lot of experience myself in NGOs, some of which are long-standing, they've got decades of history, and others of which I've been involved in startups. And Tim, for me, the idea is, a person who starts an NGO is like a person who starts a business. It requires a lot of the same skills, perceiving opportunities. You had a list of those things. And most of the startups I've been involved with are started up by a charismatic founder. But you can't answer the question for NGOs any more than you can answer the question for business, is why does somebody become an entrepreneur? A lot of sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, why is somebody an entrepreneur? And there's all these theories from the 50s. Some of them are very funny, but it's what does the founder have to do? Has to determine identify a problem, formulate a mission statement, bring together resources, bring together donors, clients, a board, staff. The whole idea of you need relations with the government, you need relations with the media. Providing feedback and so on, that was just mentioned before. So there's all these different things, and guanxi work, of course, is critical for an NGO. And it's guanxi with the party, guanxi with the state, guanxi with, I'm talking about China, but I've been talking about the US, but also guanxi with all of these different people, a huge amount of networking. So these social entrepreneurs have to be good guanxi workers, right? They have to be really, I don't know if you know the book by Daniel Bornstein, How to Change the World, and he has another book called, I'll give you the reference later. So the leader also has to figure out where his or her NGO fits in the larger division of labor. So that if you've got this field with all of these different NGOs in it, how are you different? How are you going to sell yourself to potential donors, to potential clients, to potential activists, volunteers? Well, how are you different from anybody else? And part of the problem that I agree with entirely is when you achieve your mission, do you die? Do you say, we'll declare victorious, we're going to turn our assets over to another organization? You say, look for a new mission. So I'm involved in these, I was explaining to Carolyn at lunch, an organization based in the Bay Area called the 1990 Institute, which achieved its mission. And the founders of it are in their 70s and 80s, but they decided they don't want to fold up and go away. So they asked me to be on the board. They brought in some non-ethnic Chinese, people younger than 70 and 80, to try and figure out their new mission. So that's one, these are all ways that the field changes and the stimulus for change. Organizational life cycle I don't have to talk about. But just finally, I think it's important that we don't over-idealize NGOs or civil society. I think everyone at this meeting believes that civil society is a good thing, believes that NGOs are a good thing, and that the state is bad. Or there used to be an implication, certainly in the 80s when we were doing with Tiananmen and Eastern Europe, civil society good, state bad. But I think we recognize that that is oversimplistic, and the whole third sector idea is realizing that in China, civil society with Chinese characteristics is going to involve the state one way or another. And that's one thing that the NGO people are learning to work with. My colleague Dylan Riley has studied civil society in Spain and Italy and how that led to fascism. And I think look at what's going on in Egypt, right? We celebrate the rise of the Arab Spring in civil society and what's happening. The Muslim Brotherhood, they were elected but then are they using the legislative, the regular institutions in order to clamp down, or were they trying to, on democracy? So my final punchline, my summing up my 30 plus years of going to China, living in China and going to China, is that it's a story of unintended consequences. The party has they don't have a vision, they're crossing the river by feeling for the stones. They decide at particular stages what's permissible, what's not permissible. And that all of us are actively involved both in the action and the theorizing of this whole process. Thank you for your attention.